Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, May 25th, 2020, and today we're going to be discussing a scenario in which Bernie Sanders enters himself into the 2020 presidential race. I recently made a video discussing whether or not, or the likability of Mitt Romney's entering into the 2020 race, which is close to zero, but I did make a scenario just throwing Mitt Romney into the mix, and it ended up ultimately with a defeat for President Trump. So I was trying to think what would be possibly the worst case scenario for Vice President Biden outside of a two-way race between him and Donald Trump, and that would be if Bernie Sanders did decide to run. There wasn't exactly a push as much as there was in 2016 for Bernie Sanders to run as an independent, considering the fact that he didn't have as much support in 2020 as he did in 2016. That's mainly because the race only narrowed up to a two-way race as we got through the primary season, not so much right before Iowa. And if we look, Bernie Sanders carried, he's probably going to end up with around 30% of the Democratic vote nationwide. He had that in the last time that there was polling data for the Democratic nomination, and then he dropped out, and, he ended with around 33-34% support amongst Democrats nationwide. And that could be a combination of people who just don't like Joe Biden or people that support progressive policies, but it was still only 1 in 3 Democratic voters. It wasn't enough to win him the nomination outright. So this scenario would be very beneficial to President Trump. I honestly think that this is something that the Republican Party was wishing for in 2016. If you remember, Donald Trump had really made a push for at least some third-party candidates to enter into the race. Notably, Bernie Sanders. Donald Trump was one of the only Republicans who was firm in opposition to Bernie Sanders, I guess, with the whole idea of the Democratic Party stripping the nomination from Bernie Sanders in 2016. I'm not going to take a personal opinion on that, but Donald Trump definitely made a number of speeches and a number of statements in the media or at his rallies in which he pretty much poked at Bernie Sanders and tried to convince him to either completely come out in firm opposition to Hillary Clinton or run against her as an independent. It would be the best case scenario for the GOP if this was to occur. We're talking about Donald Trump winning in some pretty solid states. While there will be some states that are going to remain safe for Joe Biden, I think that they will still go to Joe Biden, but I do think that the margins might be a tad smaller. I do think that Bernie Sanders may be able to narrow the margins just because he's only splitting the Democratic Party vote. Realistically, Bernie Sanders' ideology does not match much with the Trump agenda. It matches a lot more with the Joe Biden agenda, which means that a lot of Democrats who may not have voted for Joe Biden in the primary may have voted for Bernie Sanders, may want to vote for him in the general election if he is a candidate, or write his name in. In 2016, Bernie Sanders got around 5 to 6% of the write-in vote in Vermont, but other than that, there was no real notable push for him to run as a third-party candidate, past the primary. But in 2020, we're seeing even less, but I do think that it is a very interesting hypothetical. I don't think he would win any state except for his home state, which is the only one I think could be competitive for him, but I do think that he will narrow down the margins in a number of safe states and a number of swing states that land Donald Trump in the White House for another 4 years. So things right off the bat, Donald Trump will carry Texas, he will carry Ohio, he will carry Iowa, he will carry Georgia. These are states that were pretty solid for him in 2016. I expect to do the same if Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden were both running for president. I honestly think all three would end up on a debate stage. I think that people may say they're voting for Bernie Sanders, but when it's on election day, I don't think he's going to peak that high in terms of overall support. Ross Perot is definitely going to outperform Bernie Sanders in terms of national vote margin. Even though Bernie Sanders may be mildly popular, Joe Biden is more popular in terms of approval rating nationwide. I do think that Bernie Sanders may be able to, still strip some voters away from him. I don't think that it's completely out of the question for that to occur. So looking at the overall nationwide map, we see a number of safe states in the Northeast. I do think that states like New York will remain safe, but I think states, even Biden's home state of Delaware, will narrow down to likely, including New Jersey. These are states meaning it's going to be 13-14% in favor of Joe Biden, but it's still going to be closer. That's just coming with the fact that the support in these states is just going to dwindle because of the fact that Joe Biden is running against another type of Democrat, and obviously that splits the vote, which pretty much puts Joe Biden with the same number of electoral votes as before, but still barely winning, at least in comparison to what he would be having. I honestly think these states should all be solid blue, but again, Bernie Sanders has been in the race for I guess, quite some time in this scenario. Have to have been months if you wanted to be a notable contender. Couldn't enter 1 week before the presidential election was happening. But if we're looking at the Northeast, I think that Joe Biden may end up doing not as well as he should be in the Northeast. Again, I don't think that Americans are going to, take Bernie Sanders super seriously if the media downplays his chances at the presidency, or if he's not polling too well, which means that there's no realistic way of him getting electoral votes. But again, people may still come out in full force to vote for him. I think that Vermont, while being Bernie Sanders' home state, is still going to be close between all three of these candidates. You're going to narrow it down to possibly 33% each. I think that Bernie Sanders is very not overwhelming victory in the Democratic primary in Vermont compared to 2016 is not necessarily the best news. He only got 55% of the vote in his own home state compared to 2016, which was 83%. Though he is positively approved of there, again, it's still probably going to be around 55% of the Democratic vote, which may put him narrowly over the top, but I don't think that it's going to be a very large margin if he does win it. I'm going to say that it goes lean for Bernie Sanders, but that's the only state I'd realistically say goes to Bernie Sanders. Washington, Oregon, all narrowed down to likely states. I wouldn't say Hawaii. Let me see any of these other states. So that's pretty much it in terms of safe states. For Donald Trump, he's going to carry states such as Florida by a lean margin. Again, Bernie Sanders is probably not going to have as big of an impact in states that he didn't do very well in the Democratic primary. Yes, there will be vote splitting, but only in areas that he did well in, and there weren't that many. He only won a handful of states compared to Joe Biden. And when you're looking at states such as Florida, I honestly think Bernie Sanders might get the same amount of vote as Gary Johnson or Jill Stein, or even combined would still give Donald Trump a victory within the lean margin. So despite Bernie Sanders' vote splitting, it's not going to do much in states that he didn't have that big of a presence in the Democratic primary in the first place. As for states such as North Carolina, I do think that Donald Trump will still carry North Carolina. I think it will still be a lean margin. Again, not much is going to change in some of these southern states. I understand that Bernie Sanders may vote split, but again, we're talking about someone who didn't win these states in the primary and likely will be discounted as a regular candidate for 2020. No matter how notable your name is, think about how many countless senators and representatives ran for president in either 2016 on the Republican side or 2020 on the Democratic side. A lot of them, people could have said, oh, you could run third party, you might stir up some drama, you might force yourself on the VP ticket for the top of the top nominee, but that's usually not going to happen because Americans probably aren't going to take Bernie Sanders as a serious candidate nor a serious contender for the 2020 race. As weird as it seems, Arizona is going back to the Republican Party. It's going to go into the lean Republican column. I don't think much more will happen for the Republican Party there. While I do think that Joe Biden will carry it in a normal scenario, I think that it's enough for Donald Trump to get a victory there in the lean margin. As for the Rust Belt, Donald Trump would win this election. He would win these states, all by probably a lean margin, maybe a little bit more than 2016, considering the fact that Bernie Sanders may still have a remnants of some supporters from 2016. But Joe Biden dominated and would have dominated in Pennsylvania had Bernie Sanders remained in the race in these states in the primary. And though a primary is not an exact replication of what we will see in a presidential election, he definitely did a lot better and would have done a lot better than Hillary Clinton, and probably will, considering the fact that June 2nd is coming up soon. But, Joe Biden, I think, will outperform, but it won't be enough to overcome Donald Trump with the small but surely amount of vote splitting in these states. As for states such as New Mexico, I still think that Joe Biden will carry New Mexico. I think that's pretty much going to be a given. These are solid states for the Democratic Party. As for Colorado, I'm thinking that it does have a pretty significant impact on the presidential election, but I think that Joe Biden will narrowly carry Colorado. Even though Bernie Sanders won it in the Democratic primary, you also have to realize that even though he will be taking votes from Joe Biden, which is why it has moved from likely all the way down to tilt, again, Americans are not going to vote for someone who isn't going to win the overall election. Primaries are a perfect example. Electability is a huge issue on the Democratic side. One of the main issues that propped up Hillary Clinton and now Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders will be one of the main issues that a lot of those Bernie Sanders supporters will still end up voting for Joe Biden because they want to vote for someone who actually has a chance at the presidency. But obviously in the scenario Donald Trump has already won, he would win Nebraska's 2nd district. He would carry Maine's 2nd district as well. Maine at large, I think, does have the possibility of tilting in favor of Donald Trump. Yes, it is normally at least a Democratic state, but again, vote splitting in the Northeast in an area that was roughly 50-50 between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, more like 35-35. But I still think that Donald Trump could narrowly secure a victory there. I'm still not seeing a victory for Trump in Virginia. This state has become uncharted territory for the GOP, whether it's in the governor election or in the Senate election or in House elections or in statewide elections or in Senate districts in the state of Virginia and delegate districts in Virginia. It's become very hard for the GOP to stay relevant in Virginia, and I honestly think that will translate to a loss on the presidential side, even with this type of scenario. As for New Hampshire, again, Donald Trump's approval rating here is -18 statewide. We're talking about, the states similar to New Jersey or Connecticut or Oregon in terms of the approval rating of President Trump in New Hampshire. While I do think that Bernie Sanders will have a negative impact on Joe Biden in the Northeast, I don't think New Hampshire is going to flip. I am very certain that this state will go to Joe Biden in the presidential level by a likely margin, and I am very certain that it will go to Joe Biden even in this scenario. Though it is a tilt margin, I think Bernie Sanders, while causing harm to the Biden campaign, won't have as big of an impact as we might think. The same thing goes for candidates such as Ross Perot. Yes, they may lose the election for the Democrat or the Republican, but I don't think it's enough to flip states that we are pretty solid on right now. For Minnesota, this one is truly going to be close. I think that Joe Biden and Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are going to have to fight off for these states. I do think that Donald Trump could narrowly get a victory here, but I don't think it's going to be by a lot. That's why I think it'll be in the tilt margin. Bernie Sanders did not have as good of a showing in the primary here as many people thought. Joe Biden barely spent any time in Minnesota in terms of whether it's fundraising or it's holding campaign events. Wasn't even supposed to be the candidate that could win there, and he ended up winning it. Keep in mind, Joe Biden's primary comeback was the biggest we've seen in U.S. election history. So, at least modern U.S. election history, probably U.S. election history, bigger than Bill Clinton's. So, I would say that Joe Biden did way better than people thought. And will probably do better in 2020 than people are thinking right now. If you're being completely honest, a lot of people, while maybe currently upset with Joe Biden's comments or may not be in full-fledged support of him right now, if Donald Trump's approval rating keeps taking hits like it is right now, he will likely win the election in 2020. As for the state of Nevada, I'm thinking it really all depends. Nevada always overestimates Republicans in terms of polling data, so it's really hard to figure out the landscape of the state, but it does have a very negative view of President Trump right now, and overall net negative of 10% in the state. And also, election history shows us that this is historically a Democratic state. Though Bernie Sanders did win the Nevada caucus here, again, that support only goes so far. There may be 40% of Democrats supporting Bernie Sanders, but most of those Democrats, at least, are going to end up voting for Joe Biden if he is the nominee. Primary support doesn't always turn out to independent candidate type support. Joe Biden, I think, will do fairly well in Nevada. I think that this state is honestly going to be a pure toss-up in my point of view. If I was to bet, I'd say that it could narrowly go to Donald Trump just because there may be just that tiny bit of voters that are angry enough with Joe Biden as the nominee that may end up voting for Bernie Sanders rather than just sucking it up and voting for Joe Biden like they did for Hillary Clinton in 2016. But again, this is a very unlikely scenario. Bernie Sanders has not hinted at running into the race as an independent, and it would end up with Joe Biden losing the election at 211 electoral votes, Donald Trump at 318, Bernie Sanders at 3, and for the state of Nevada at toss-up, but I'll put it in the tilt Republican column for right now. So that's pretty much it. I honestly think that this would never really happen. Bernie Sanders has already gotten a lot of blame for supposedly losing the 2016 election, so that's something I definitely wouldn't think that he would want to be on his back for 2020, but you never know. And it's always fun to speculate, and this map is more than likely what I believe would happen in a scenario such as this. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all tomorrow.